Thanks so much for coming on this blustery Friday. I'm Dylan Siegler, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Engagement at the Institute of Politics. And along with a number of partners and stakeholders, we've developed the Shriver Program for Leadership in Public Service, and we're so glad that all of you are here. This is the third of 4 workshops, and along with my colleague Jamie Price here, who is the Executive Director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute, we are offering a deep dive look at the creation of the Peace Corps and taking a look at that from all angles. And we're so glad to have Bill Josephson here with us. And Bill was the general counsel of the Peace Corps and also had a lot to do with it actually coming to fruition. So he speaks from direct experience, and we love hearing his insights. So these are our 2 folks who will be helping us out with the third workshop. Let me just give you a little quick background on the whole academic year Shriver program. So this quarter we've had 3 of 4 workshops, and then we have what's called the Shriver Undergraduate Fellowship, which we're offering. The application for that is due November 24th at 11:59 p.m. That fellowship is for any undergraduate. We're ideally looking for students who have a lot of experience in public service, who are excited to really commit themselves from January to June of 2015 to this program to kind of like make it one of their big things that they're doing here on campus. We're looking for students who are interested in problem solving, who are creative, who are innovative, who want to take approaches like Sargent Shriver did to creating the Peace Corps to urban problems here in the city of Chicago. The application is up on Chicago Career Connection, and it's pretty elaborate. We've kind of filled in everything that we're looking for. We're looking for a resume, a cover letter, an essay. And in a dream world, you have attended all of the workshops or will attend, or if you had to miss a session, they're all up online. And we've tried to really communicate how you can watch the videos from the workshop, so you don't have to feel like, you know, you missed a whole chunk of this case study. We, in a dream world, are giving preference to students who will be returning next year, but we are looking for the leadership of, yeah, you can just grab a seat right there. Oh, that's perfect, Jade. We're looking for students who, you know, 4th years are welcome to apply. 1st years are welcome to apply, okay? Because we're looking for all kinds of experience. And 4th years, even though you wouldn't be returning next year to mentor the next class of Shriver Fellows, you have a lot of leadership skills that you could offer. Finally, for the 12 or 15 students selected as Shriver Undergraduate Fellows, there's a guaranteed internship. So what does that mean? That means that we will have a $4,000 stipend reserved for you for summer 2015. As a group, January to June, you'll be looking at an urban challenge, for example, something like developing the Chicago Peace Corps, which might be a program in violent neighborhoods to bring sustainable peace. And this would be something that you guys would develop on your own. And if through that you develop opportunities for summer internships, that might be an internship you'd work on summer 2015. Or you might say the Shriver National Center for Poverty Law. Gracelyn, right up here is good if you want. So the National Poverty Law Center, which is here in Chicago, might have wonderful internship opportunities, and if that's where you want to take your stipend, you're welcome to do that. So there's a lot of freedom. I've heard questions like, how's that going to work? And we'll work with you to make sure that what you're doing in the summer is relevant and is also something where you can learn new skills and bring a lot to it. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, but I'll be here after the session. I'll be sitting right over there. If you have questions about how any of these pieces work, you can feel free to let me know or always email me too. So Jamie, you're on.
Okay. Well, thank you and welcome to the third session. This one, first time we focused on Sarge's method. Last time we focused on the implementation, the formulation of the Peace Corps. The primary focus this time is going to be on the politics and the political battles that were fought to establish it. There'll be no PowerPoint this time around. We'll basically be going through the timeline that you have in front of you here, and our primary text is this man who who lived it all, directed a lot of it, and so we'll be engaged in kind of an interview format with him. I'll lead that, but we'll also be taking questions from you. So, but I also know that Bill wants to make, before we enter into that, Bill wants to make a couple of comments to gather up what we've been doing so far, so we can lead it into this next bit. And before I go, I just want to point your attention to this thing that's also in front of you. Tim Shriver, Sergeant Shriver's son, my boss, is coming on Monday. I wish I could come back for that. He's a wonderful speaker, a terrific guy, has written a brilliant book, and if you can come back, you won't be sorry. Bill.
So, thank you everybody for coming. It really continues to be a pleasure for me to come back to Chicago and to see so many of you here, an extraordinary turnout that is very, very gratifying. And I wanted to take a moment or two and address some of the themes that Jamie has been developing, particularly the theme of service and the theme of compassion that are so central to Sarge's public policies. And I'd like to hark you back, if you will, to the two papers that were in your documents for the last session. The Millikan paper, which, as you know from what I distributed, was specifically commissioned by JFK. But the Millikan paper has always struck me, perhaps it struck you this way too, as devoid of both service and of compassion. You're saying yes. Tell me why you agree with me.
Why it's devoid of service and compassion? Well, I think sometimes it might be difficult to be able to successfully portray service and compassion in these kinds of documents, and maybe that was part of the reason why it didn't come. I mean, we've been talking about it, we've been so explicit, and we've been having like PowerPoints saying, you know, this is what it is, this is what goes into it, service and compassion, and what does that mean? And with that in mind, I mean, I guess maybe I was different from other people in understanding it this way, but with that in mind, it was kind of missing that explicit, you know, that explicit like understanding and that explicit like explanation of why it's important and what those two things mean.
Well, I think that that's exactly right. Exactly right. Do you think that the Hayes paper is different? I mean, I think the Hayes paper is different. But does anybody think that the Hayes paper is qualitatively different from the Millikan paper? Well, at least let me say why I think it is. First of all, I think the Hayes paper is short. And it's important if you're trying to persuade somebody to take a new initiative. It's important to be short. And the Hayes paper, I think, bespeaks humanity. It's very humane. And it really does talk about service in a way that the Millikan paper only pays, I think, excuse the expression, lip service to. The one problem with the Hayes paper politically, does anybody know what the one problem with the Hayes paper politically, thinking back to the context in which it was written in September of 1960? Well, what do you think the chances would have been in September of 1961 of establishing the Peace Corps as part of the United Nations? You're smiling.
Pretty small.
Why pretty small?
Well, the UN is a huge monster of an organization in and of itself, and the Peace Corps was like a new very new, very unsure, very untested program that also aimed to do like a really different type of diplomacy kind of, then I think they would have been comfortable with.
Why do you think Sam believed in that? Everything you say I think is true, but nevertheless that's what he argued for. Why do you think so? Why do you think he argued for that?
I think it comes back to compassion, and I think the youth aspect of the Peace Corps is actually really interesting, because instead of having these diplomats who are employed to, you know, smooth things over with foreign nationals and everything, you have these like young people who really want to make things right, which maybe is a different thing.
Well, that's all true, I think, but also politically impossible. Couldn't have been done. For example, we had a little provision in the Peace Corps Act that authorized the assignment of volunteers to the United Nations and international agencies. Tiny little provision, just, you know, little extra piece of authority. And when we got to the Senate floor, Senator Humphrey, who later, you know, became vice president, Senator Humphrey was the manager of the bill on behalf of the administration. And the Republican person who was assigned to cover the Peace Corps bill was a senator from Iowa named Burke Hickenlooper, very smart. Burke was extremely smart, but he always looked a little bit like he had just chewed an enormously dill pickle. But he wanted to take that provision out. And I said, you know, Humphrey and Hickenlooper and I are sitting here together negotiating, and I said, well, you know, Senator, it's the administration's position, and it should stay in. UN is a good thing. There are a lot of international programs. This would enhance the allure of the Peace Corps as a service opportunity. And I learned a great lesson from Senator Humphrey, which seems to have been forgotten by too many politicians in the Congress these days. Hubert said to me, Bill, you have to understand that I'm the leader here, but I'm also the leader of the whole Senate. And Senator Hickenlooper and I have lots of things to deal with. We are going to compromise. And the compromise essentially was that we adopted a numerical limit to the number of volunteers that could be assigned to UN programs. The other point I want to make, going back, is it struck me that using Jamie's framework of service and compassion, although, you know, obviously Warren Wiggins and I were completely unaware of this conceptual framework, but the towering task, with its emphasis on work, ordinary work, and work with the people with whom you were working, not as too much of the foreign aid program did and does, not telling them how it should be done, but doing whatever they do with them. And it struck me, as I said, although we didn't know it at the time, that this exhibited both service and compassion. And perhaps that's why, you know, perhaps that's why at this amazing meeting in the Mayflower Hotel that was attended by incoming Secretary of the Treasury Dillon, that's why I think, Jamie, the meeting had to have taken place earlier in January than you think, because he wasn't Secretary of the Treasury yet. He had been nominated, but not. And Ted Sorensen, who was Kennedy's special counsel. And in front of everybody around this table was a copy of the Towering Task. And Sarge simply said, I want you to read it, turn the pages, because this is the Peace Corps that I imagine we're going to do. Not the Milliken Peace Corps, not the Hayes Peace Corps. not the Albertson Berkey University of Colorado Peace Corps. This is the Peace Corps.
Thank you. Any questions to this point? Great. Thank you, Bill. Well, as we talked about last time, and I see, well, there I think a couple of typos on your. You can see that we need a February where March is, and maybe that's to Bill's point that. And then the report to the president is on the 22nd. But the task force did its work. The report goes to the president based on the towering task and the other kind of policy initiatives that we talked about, which would kind of inculcate, as we began to touch on last time, a kind of policies of compassion and service in practical ways that would happen. And then JFK has an executive order presented to him. Did you write that?
I did write that, and you have to understand that in the process creating something, there are many strands. We've been focusing so far on the programmatic strand, which of course is always the most important. Always the most important. You don't get the program right, forget it. But on the other hand, the program needs a container. And so, as the only lawyer working in the group, it fell to me to figure out what the container should be. And I decided that the president had authority under the Mutual Security Act by executive order to create a wholly new agency. And since Warren and Sarge and I firmly believe that the Peace Corps needed its own container, I set out to draft that executive order, which you can see is in your papers. It's very short. But the process was difficult. First of all, I had to deal with my legal counterparts in ICA, in the Foreign Aid Program, in the State Department. So there was a long negotiation with fellow lawyers about what the executive order should say, and did we agree that the president had the authority to do this? And once the executive order emerged from the lawyers, then it had to go to what is now called the Office of Management and Budget, but was then simply called the Budget Division, the Budget Bureau. And there was a wonderful man in the Budget Bureau named Fred Levy, who had actually supervised the drafting of every executive order since George Washington. He had forgotten more about executive orders than any of us would ever remember. And Fred and I sat down and he looked at my executive order and he simplified it tremendously. And then, of course, one had to deal with the President's Counsel, with Ted, and Ted approved the order. So when the report to the President went to the President, the executive order was ready for the President to sign.
Thank you. And then and just so you know, when we or when Bill or I refer to a document, they are all in the Dropbox. Is that right? So you.
And we sent them out to everyone who had registered. I think we sent them out Wednesday evening. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And then we send them out. We follow up and say, here's where you can find them.
Right. So all the documents we referred to, you have either read or have access to. The executive order gets signed. The president goes the same day, gives a special message to Congress, which we talked about last time. But almost before the ink is dry in his signature, administrative battles begin. There's the issue of, is Sarge going to be the director or not? He's only been charged to be the task force to this point, and as you will see from the letters you have, in the next couple of days he offered to resign. What was going on with that, Bill?
Well, I don't actually know, because my recollection is that there was never any question in my mind that Sarge would be directed. And one of the documents you have, actually, is a memorandum that I wrote to a man named Richard Goodwin, who was Ted Sorensen's assistant. And I had identified a vacant advice and consent appointment authority that was in an obscure reorganization plan that dated from the 50s. And so this memorandum, Dick, said, you know, the president wants to appoint Sarge. It should be an advice and consent appointment. That's important for Sarge's status. And status, whether you like it or not, status in a bureaucracy, unfortunately, is always an issue. So if you're, dealing with Mr. Labouisse, who's going to have a presidential appointment as the head of aid, and with the Secretary of State and the Undersecretary of State, and so forth and so on, it'd be good to be in the same grouping. And I didn't know this until I saw these documents that we got out of the Kennedy Library, but I didn't know that Sarge had written what I regard as an unusual letter, handwritten letter from him to the president. Not the usual self-effacing Shriver, but a Shriver who clearly understood that he needed a certain status, but was a little bit reluctant, blatantly, to ask for it. And so, as Jamie says, he suggests that there are many people who could be better directors of the Peace Corps than he. I don't know whether he was really serious about that. I don't know what you think, Jamie. But he writes, he obviously includes with his handwritten memo to the president, my memo to Goodwin. Because you'll see at the bottom of my memo to Goodwin, there's a subscript. JFK, I agree with this, Sarge. And so was.
But I mean, clearly, I think he would have been willing to step down if JFK hadn't acceded to that. I don't think he said that. I don't think he said that lightly, but it obviously signals.
How would the Peace Corps have turned out had Sarge not been appointed as director?
Well, that depends on whether you have any notions about who might have taken it over.
It's kind of part of the question, right?
I never thought about it. Never occurred to me.
It would have become, as you'll see as we go forward, I think it would have become, whoever was running it, it would have become part of USAID.
Yeah, probably, Jamie is probably right. It probably, well, we're now getting a little ahead of our story. I think we're about to answer your question. Okay?
Sound good?
Because the next thing that happens, and Jamie and I have pinpointed it down to Friday, March 17th. One of the things that I'm doing, if only to keep my eye on the enemy, was I'm also sitting on the task force in the State Department that is drafting the new foreign aid legislation. Yes?
Can you talk more about who the enemy is specifically?
Say that again so that everybody can hear you.
Can you talk more about who the enemy is? What are the opposing forces that are going against what's on?
That's what I'm about to tell you. Okay? The draft of what you have in your documents of President Kennedy's special message on foreign aid said explicitly that the Peace Corps would be lumped into the new aid agency. And you may recall that Warren Wiggins and I started out talking about the importance of completely revamping the foreign aid agency. That's how we ultimately got to write the Towering Task. There was no question, but that needed to be completely rethought. And it is very extensively rethought in the president's message. A lot of detail about what should be and what should not be in the new foreign aid program, and also a lot of detail about what the program should try to accomplish, how it should be different from mutual security, how it should focus on development and development issues. But there was this sentence. So I took the document, the draft message, to Warren Wiggins, and then we both walked in to see Sarge's assistant. Where is Sarge? Well, he's in Boston. So Warren and I flew up to Boston, and we met Sarge at the Ritz-Carlton where he was staying, and we showed him the document. This is by now Saturday. And back in those days, there were no things called business centers. There were things called public stenographers. We went down to the basement of the Ritz-Carlton, hired the public stenographer, and wrote a memorandum to the president. And I believe, although I can't tell you for sure, that you'll see in the documents attached to Sarge's letters to Henry Laboise, the incoming head of AID, and to Ralph Dungan, who was the White House staffer assigned to work on the foreign aid program issues, you'll see that there are 3 memoranda attached to that argue for the independence of the Peace Corps. I'm sure that one of them is the Ritz-Carlton memorandum, but I can't tell you which one.
Bill, this generated obviously a major threat, as we talked about it last time, in you and in Bill Wiggins, and obviously in Sarge, that what was at stake for the Peace Corps in its not being independent?
We thought that if the Peace Corps were simply another agency bird in the foreign aid program, it would be much less attractive to people who wanted to volunteer. And we also thought that countries chafing, as many of them were, under the excesses of mutual security, would be far less interested in a Peace Corps that seemed to be part of the foreign aid program. So we were very worried about this sentence because we thought it jeopardized the ability of the Peace Corps to capitalize on these 2 themes that Jamie and I have been talking about, the theme of service and the theme of compassion. We did not want to be buried overseas in the foreign aid program with PX privileges and living apart and working apart and telling people what to do as opposed to working with them.
The whole mission of the Peace Corps that you had devised would be compromised.
We felt that.
Yeah.
So I remember that I took this memorandum back to Washington, and I remember walking across the park to the White House and giving it to Dick. And we waited.
Dick Goodwin.
Dick Goodwin. And we waited to see what would happen. And what happened, you have to understand the nature of the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy rarely deals with things cleanly. So here's the offending sentence. The Peace Corps, I propose that our separate and often confusing aid programs be integrated into a single administration, embracing the present Washington and field operations of ICA, the Development Loan Program, Food for Peace, the local currency lending activities, the Export-Import Bank, the Peace Corps. And this is what was added to that phrase. The Peace Corps, recognizing its distinctive contribution beyond the area of economic development. And here's a paragraph that did not exist in the prior draft. Programs such as the Peace Corps and Food for Peace far from being submerged, will be used more effectively and their distinctive identity and appeal preserved. And Food for Peace will continue to be based on availabilities determined by the Department of Agriculture. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this is that the head of Food for Peace, somebody that you later became famous, George McGovern, was the incoming head of Food for Peace, who left shortly to run for the Senate from his home state of South Dakota. And as you know, when Gene McCarthy vanished to have his affair with Shana Alexander at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, and no one was there to pick up the Kennedy delegates, George McGovern, as he put it, picked up the fallen standard. And that, of course, laid the predicate for his run for president with Sarge in 1972. So, here we are, Jamie. We have all of this waffle. And what happens next?
Well, it looks like Sarge is reading the positive side of the waffle. The president then, as we say, on the a few days later, appoints Henry Labouisse to head the reorganization task force. Labouisse was appointed by the president to run ICA, the International Cooperation Agency, to reorganize the task force. And so Sarge writes him a letter attaching your Boston memo, and he says, toward the end of it, I hope you and I can settle this thing between us without engaging all the troops in a Cecil B. DeMille encounter of lawyers, economists, and other experts. Perhaps this is the wrong way to conduct governmental operations, but I certainly hope it will be successful in ridding you of a minor headache and relieving me of a major one.
What do you think? If you were Henry Labouisse, how would you react to that? Well, I think your reaction is correct. There's no evidence that I've ever seen that he ever did.
No.
What does that mean?
Sarge is saying that he doesn't want to have a power battle over this. That he would rather have Labouisse acknowledge the arguments that Bill had made about this not being a government-to-government program, but a people-to-people program. About this, how did that argument ever, when you made it to Dungan or to Labouisse or to the Kennedy staffers, how did they reply?
Well, you're getting a little bit ahead of the story, I think, because the next signal event, is the Bay of Pigs and the disaster. I mean, this throws a monkey wrench into everything that was going on. JFK had inherited this Allen Dulles CIA plan to try to overthrow Castro. And I guess in retrospect, he did say that he just simply wasn't experienced enough to trust his instincts to derail it at that point. And he believed the experts who said that the invasion would be greeted by an uprising in Cuba. Of course, none of that ever happened. So very early in the Kennedy administration, he suffers a foreign and domestic policy disaster. And then, because it was very important to find out if countries really wanted Peace Corps volunteers, Sarge leaves on his round-the-world trip. And you've got documents in your papers that show where he visited, who he met, pictures, and so forth and so on. This was crucial because we needed to know whether or not countries would ask for Peace Corps volunteers. And this brought out what I think had always been true of Shriver, the salesman in him. That's essentially what he did at the Merchandise Mart. When Joseph P. Kennedy bought the Merchandise Mart in 1946, it was empty. And now, as you know, if you've ever been downtown and wandered through it, it's a thriving showcase for American commerce. And Sarge was the salesman. He's the person who sold all of that. And he sold the Peace Corps. But then, there was a meeting in the White House which Jamie dates on May 26th.
April 26th.
April 26th.
And I got my date from, oh yeah. See?
The visits unsuccessful?
No, they were all successful. They were all successful. They were all just like the Peace Corps. He didn't just drop in and say, "Hey, I'm here." They were all invited. They all knew what he was going to talk about, and the tour involved him talking with the heads of state and going out into the communities where Peace Corps volunteers would work. They were all successful. As a matter of fact, word got around so much that by the time he got back, there were other requests waiting with the president. So,
And this, I should mention, led to another strain because of work that one had to do. We needed to have executive agreements with all these countries so that Peace Corps volunteers could come in and Peace Corps staff could come in. But they were very different from the AID agreements because, as I said before, no relief from customs, no relief from host country civil and criminal jurisdiction. Basically we just needed to have a very simple agreement that said Peace Corps volunteers would come and Peace Corps volunteers would be treated like everybody else.
Yeah.
Yes?
Were there any special cases with countries where U.S. relations with that country might have not been so great? But
Yes, India was a great concern.
did you hear the question? Yeah. Were there any countries where relationships were not so great?
India was a great concern because it was then the country that was the head of the unaligned countries. And of course, Nehru was an extraordinarily willful and difficult person. So it was amazing to us that Nehru bought into the Peace Corps. He could easily have seen it as the Russians, with whom India had a very close relationship with respect to military assistance at that time. He could have seen it as the Russians portrayed it, as a group of American spies, but he did not. And his support of the Peace Corps was extraordinarily influential throughout the world. But in the middle of this, in the middle of Sarge's tour, there's a meeting in the White House that Ralph Dungan calls, one of President Kennedy's special assistants. And I'm there, and Henry LaBouisse is there, and David Bell, the head of the budget division, who had been assigned by McGeorge Bundy, President Kennedy's special assistant for foreign affairs, to oversee the work of the LaBouisse task force. And Bell was an extremely intelligent, cool, far-seeing, wonderful person. But LaBouisse was absolutely adamant. He was going to keep the Peace Corps no matter what. And no one, except myself, was prepared to take him on that. And Ralph purported, on behalf of the President, specifically on behalf of the President, to settle the issue that the Peace Corps would be part of AID. And we cabled Sarge the summary of that meeting.
I have just a question. What were, sort of to go back to my other question, you guys were so clear that Peace Corps mission was going to be completely undercut if it were part of. This was a major battle. Obviously, the others, the enemies, if you will, the people who in the president's advisors and the folks in organizing foreign aid were feeling that no, this was the wrong decision. What was their concern?
Well, remember that foreign aid was a big deal, a big and important, expensive program. The Peace Corps was a little, untried, untested program. So the Peace Corps, in the context of the foreign aid program, didn't have a lot of weight. The other factor, which I think is also something you need to get into your head when you're dealing with your bureaucracy, bureaucrats like neatness. They like consolidation. They don't like messiness. And this was very much, if you will, a McKinsey and Company kind of exercise. Let's take all of these various strands that the president delineates in his special message, and let's put them together in a coherent, not an incoherent, whole.
So the issue wasn't that they thought the Peace Corps was wrong-headed or that they thought it might work, but that it needed to be inside their box.
They couldn't see it outside the box.
Okay. So,
yes, please.
Was the buy-in from countries like India and the rest of the countries on the list contingent on the independence of the Peace Corps?
That's an interesting question.
in those documents, yes, they were. That's certainly what Sarge was selling, and in the notes that come back, it's very clear that people want it to be independent. They want it to be something else. They don't really trust the other kinds of aid efforts from Russia or
Remember,
from
aid
the
is a
US.
Cold War program. Was, and it stayed as such. Yes.
We learned.
Please speak so that everyone can hear you, even way down in that corner.
During our first workshop, we learned that the Peace Corps was an example where for a need to have like spiritual value within the government, but today we see that the Peace Corps program itself was trying to pull away from any like political or government. I don't really want to say influence, but ties, I suppose. Like, what was the extent to how much was the government really like tied to the Peace Corps?
Well, we needed money.
Was that so?
We needed appropriations, okay? And we needed to have an authorizing act, because you can't have appropriations without an authorizing statute. So whether it was the Peace Corps would wind up in the Foreign Aid Act or the Peace Corps Act, as it finally did, we needed legislation. And we needed legislation before we could get an appropriation. You know, the Congress is divided between the authorizing committees, the substantive committees that work on program, and the appropriations committees that actually decide how much will be spent. And the appropriations committees have subcommittees, and the subcommittees divide up the government. And for example, while we were able, as you will see shortly, to have the Peace Corps Act enacted independently of foreign aid, we were never able to get the appropriation away from the Foreign Aid Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. Try as we might, and we did try, we were never able to do that. Otto Passman, a very, very tough-minded, difficult congressman from Louisiana, who later went to jail, was absolutely obdurate. Yes, you have a question.
I do. Do you think, looking back, that...
Louder.
Do you think, looking back, that there's another statute that you could have used as the authority that would have moved you further away from being connected to foreign aid?
No. And you had a question.
My question was that, do you think the fact that the Peace Corps would be independent yet be helpful in regards to Sarge's vision was a cause for concern among the committees, the different levels committees, because there was a sense of independence, and there was like almost no political ties that drove them crazy, that started the political battle.
That's a very shrewd question. We're going to get ahead of the story a little bit, okay? No, that's all right. That's fine. In the House Foreign Affairs Committee, in the authorizing committee in the House, the Peace Corps always enjoyed tremendous bipartisan support. Republicans, Democrats, no question about it. Peace Corps Act passed the House by something like 430, something like that. Amazing number. The story in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was quite different because the chairman, J. William Fulbright, hated the Peace Corps. Yes? Why did he hate the Peace Corps? You're shaking your head.
Because it's an interesting tidbit of information about Fulbright.
You got to say that so that you can be heard out there.
I found that piece of information about Fulbright interesting, so I nodded.
And we will come back to Fulbright.
We'll come back. We'll come back to that, okay? But you have to understand that in the Senate, it was not a piece of cake. You got a powerful chairman, long-serving chairman, one of the Southern group, with Richard Russell and Alan Ellender and John Stennis, just to reel off names of the people who really exercised power in the Democratic Senate in those days. A very different group of Democrats than what you're used to now, where I think now we have not a single senator or representative from the Deep South in the Democratic. I think
that's true. Just one thing, I would just say to your comment that yes, I think it's fair to assume that the notion that they wanted to have an independent political operation that was so popular that was reaching out across the globe, whereas another apparatus was saying, wait a minute, no, that's our job. So I'm sure there was a power dynamic going on. We don't have it. But I mean, it's reasonable to say, particularly the intransigence. It isn't like an argument about, well, what structure should this be in? There's just a lot of energy around this question, and so it's deep rooted.
Was one reason LaVuise wanted the Peace Corps under the Foreign Aid umbrella was that the Foreign Aid Appropriations Act would be much more of a sure deal than getting appropriations for the Peace Corps independently?
He thought that the Peace Corps would enhance his own program, which of course was not popular. And he recognized the Peace Corps would be popular. But, that's really a tail wagging the dog argument.
But you were trying to give him a benevolent take on it, right, to try to protect the Peace Corps, protect its funding, getting funding because foreign aid would be funded. Yeah.
Anyway, in your documents...
Dylan had a question.
I know that, but I'm looking at the clock.
Yeah.
In your documents, you have documents about the National Advisory Council. Now, people might think National Advisory Councils were worthless. They're not worthless. They give you a lot of political support. They give you a lot of political cover. And you'll see that Sarge recommended 3 people to head the National Advisory Council. Justice William O. Douglas, well, that was out of the question because that's not what Supreme Court justices do. David Lilienthal is a figure from the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Roosevelt New Deal figure, created the Tennessee Valley Authority, then had a private company in New York that was building controversial dams all over the world. So that was out of the question. And the third person on the list you'll see is the vice president. And that turned out to be crucial because Sarge telegraphs Bill Moyers, the vice president's assistant, to get the vice president involved in this issue. and the vice president asks for a meeting with the president. And so we all convene again in Ralph Dungan's office. LaBouisse, David Bell, myself, and Lyndon Johnson. And we wait. And we all expected to meet with the president, but we wound up not meeting with the president. You have a wonderful letter from Bill Moyers in your papers describing Johnson's behavior and why Johnson felt so strongly about Peace Corps independence that comes out of his own experience in hard-scrabble Texas during the Depression. And I swear, Johnson spent the whole time, as we were waiting to see Kennedy, hectoring LaBouisse. I thought at one point Johnson, who was a really big man, 6'4", was going to pick Harry up by his ears and lift him up. Later that night, Johnson saw Kennedy and persuaded him that the Peace Corps would be independent. And I no longer remember how we got that news, but I picked up the phone, called Ralph Dungan, and I said to Ralph something like, I'd like to come over, smoke a pipe of peace, we need to be working together, we can help you, you can help us. Ralph told me to drop dead. Said, you wanted to be on your own, you're on your own. Don't come running to us for help when you need help.
And remember, Sarge is out of the country this whole time. All of this is happening. And we didn't say lots of other things are happening too. I mean, this is a very detailed and busy time for Bill, but recruiting is going on, training is going on. All of those people listed there under March when Sarge pulled together the agency and launched all those
host country negotiations that started in the wake of Sarge's trip were going on.
Yeah, I mean, now he has countries requesting Peace Corps volunteers, so he's got to have Peace Corps volunteers. It means you got to recruit them. It means you got to retrain them.
You got to send program people to the various countries to figure out what the program should be.
All of this is going on. I mean, a number of people that I talked to when I've talked about Sarge, I guess, have said he was the finest public administrator they've ever run into. That, I mean, not only did he have vision, but he was able to do these things. Bill once told me, in reference to one of the thinkers that he praises, Isaiah Berlin, that Sarge was the only person that you ever met, if I have this right, who was both a fox and a hedgehog.
Right.
Now,
I am too, incidentally.
Takes one to know one. There was Berlin wrote a book. It's called The Fox and the Hedgehog.
No. That's not right. He wrote an essay.
Sorry.
He wrote an essay on Tolstoy's theory of history.
Well, I called it a book because it had two covers.
And he headed it with a quote from a fragment of a Greek philosopher about whom we know absolutely nothing, which simply said, the fox knows many things. The hedgehog knows one big thing.
That's right. And he went on to call Tolstoy a hedgehog and to explain why. But
yes,
I
both.
was just wondering, the funding that was supporting the setup, was that kind of guaranteed as different from USAID, or like where was that coming from?
that's a very good question. Bill arranged that, and yes, it's different.
Okay, so now it's been decided. You had a question. Yes, you were simultaneous.
Okay, I just
Louder.
I wanted to ask about how he was able to be both a fox and hedgehog at the same time, because just to learn kind of characteristics to pick up on.
You have an understanding of the big picture, as you kids would call it. And you also know, as Le Corbusier once said, that the devil is in the details. So many people, have the big picture, and many people have the details. But very few people have the big picture and understand the importance of the details.
And
Yes.
Was it possible to fund the Peace Corps through private philanthropy? And if the Peace Corps were to be set up again today, would the appropriation be the best job?
Oh, they keep wanting to get to this.
We
All
better
right,
get
so,
there.
all right.
But let me just say one thing about the fox and the hedgehog. The way it manifests itself in what we've been talking about is the hedgehog part of Sarge was somebody who could recognize, operating in the world, the big picture of how compassion and service change things. And at the same time, not just stay there in those values, but recognize how to put them into,
Let me put it to you this way. We haven't stressed enough Sarge's faith. Wasn't Christ a hedgehog and a fox? Wasn't St. Paul a hedgehog and a fox? Not getting any response.
Okay.
What do you think, Jamie?
Paul certainly was.
No question about that.
Jesus? It would be terrible to say no, wouldn't it? I don't think he had a lot of
Remember
foxy
what he
things to
said
do.
to the apostles,
Probably.
which is very much a theme of Peace Corps volunteers and how they were sent overseas to work. Take nothing with you.
And that was a major text for Sarge in doing this. But that too is a whole nother session and the kind of thing we'll also talk about in the winter and spring.
Okay, Dylan, I'm pausing now for a second because I feel more comfortable about the time. What was your question?
Well, mine was just a comment because I found this very helpful a couple of years ago when we started reaching out to government agencies to build opportunities. So the Peace Corps, the way it is currently set up, is a government agency just like the Department of Commerce, the Department of Transportation, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, right? So this was very helpful. So there are cabinet level agencies, and those are many of the ones that I just named: U.S. Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, and then there's a U.S. Department of State, U.S. AID, and then the U.S. Peace Corps. So that is its own government agency.
There are elements of the history here that, remember, was created by executive order. So executive orders can be modified. Executive orders can be repealed. And in fact, as you may know, Nixon, who hated the Peace Corps, changed the Peace Corps' executive order and stuck it into an agency called Action. And it withered in action. It went from 15,000 volunteers in 1967 to 4,000 when President Carter appointed Dick Celeste to be director of the Peace Corps. And Dick said, could you please come down to Washington and do an executive order that will get us out of action? Carter will sign it. And I did, and we did another executive order, and we took the Peace Corps out of action. And then Dick and I, with the extraordinary help of Senator from California, Alan Cranston, got the Senate to pass legislation that made the Peace Corps statutorily independent. no longer dependent on the whim of the president at the time. That didn't happen until 1980, 1981. So the Peace Corps you're talking about in structure is very different from the Peace Corps that we're talking about today.
Yeah, and to link your comment, or at least what I inferred from it, to yours, if it means something that acting in the world this way is acting on behalf of the U.S. government. So if it had been funded, if it were another philanthropic organization out there, like many, many are, it wouldn't have the impact that it does to say, this is the way the U.S. government wants to work in the world. So it needed to be independent, but also governmental. At least I think so.
Yes.
I guess going back to my question, I'm curious how in all of these kind of political wonderings and figuring out what container to put it in, how it was still keeping momentum, like how the program was still being developed, and like that's a really amazing thing to finagle, and how that worked.
It was amazing. And all this time, Bill was writing this legislation. Starting in March, all the time Sarge was gone.
So you can see, I guess this comes out of Scott's book, that he thinks I finished the draft of the Peace Corps Act.
It comes from Scott Stossel's biography. That's where I got
He thinks I finished the draft of the Act on May 11, which, you know, is just a few days after the Dungan meeting. So I must have been working on it one way or the other. And Jamie and I had a very interesting conversation in preparation of this. You want to talk about purposes?
Yeah. I asked Bill, and I'll ask him again, I mean, the purpose of the Peace Corps is the first couple of sentences of the Peace Corps Act. And I asked Bill when in the process he wrote this. And I'll read it to you. So if you go to the bill, it's it's in the Dropbox. The Congress of the United States declares that it is the policy of the United States and the purpose of this act to promote world peace and friendship through a Peace Corps. We shall make available to interested countries and areas men and women of the United States qualified for service abroad and willing to serve under conditions of hardship if necessary. To help the people of such countries and areas in meeting their needs for trained manpower and to promote a better understanding of the American people on the part of the people served and a better understanding of other peoples on the part of the American people. But that first sentence, the Congress of the United States declares that it is the policy of the United States and the purpose of this act to promote world peace and friendship through a Peace Corps. And I asked Bill, when did you write that?
Well, I don't know when I wrote it, but there obviously are strands in the President's special message on the Peace Corps which are relevant here. Here's the last paragraph. Most heartening of all, the initial reaction to the proposal has been an enthusiastic response by students, professional organizations, private citizens everywhere. A convincing demonstration that we have in this country an immense reservoir of dedicated men and women willing to devote their energies and time and toil to the cause of world peace and human progress. So my strong guess is I took it from there. You know, it's always the lawyer's search for precedent. You know, we're never comfortable, you know, unless we can point to authority for something that we're about to do. Mm-hmm. And of course, earlier in the message, he talks about the needs for skilled manpower, skilled workers overseas. So I must have taken those strands that Jamie just read out of the special message and welded them together.
Yes.
What direct benefits did the Peace Corps bring to the U.S.? Because I understand that its objective was to instill peace and compassion around the world. But I feel like that wouldn't be really enough to just convince the Congress to appropriate money to this organization.
Former Peace Corps volunteers say almost unanimously that the Peace Corps was far more important to them in their own development than anything they did overseas. Now, they may not be right about that, but that's what they say, almost unanimous. And certainly it was part of President Kennedy's goal. And you'll see this in one of the documents that we have for the last session next Friday. You'll see that Caroline Kennedy wrote a book called Listening In, which is a transcription of conversations that were taped by JFK. There's only one that deals with Shriver, and Shriver is calling up with a concern about CIA plant, I think I talked about this earlier, in a Thailand training program. But what does the president do? He immediately changes the subject. He changes the subject to, when are we going to have 100,000 former volunteers? What provisions are we making for volunteers to serve in the Foreign Service, in the civil service? And in your papers you will see, I don't know whether the president was aware of this at the time he had this conversation, but you will see that within days the president signed yet another executive order authorizing former Peace Corps volunteers to be appointed to the Foreign Service and the civil service if they had served satisfactorily a full term of service without a competitive exam. So we were striving for that even then. And, you know, one can name, I mean, I don't know, Christopher Hill, who was in charge of all of the negotiations with North Korea during the last round of 6, if you know about the round of 6. Chris is a Cambodian volunteer, now the dean of the Foreign Service School at the University of Denver. I mean, I could give you hundreds of examples.
And more closer, I don't know, and not closer to that, but in response to your question, next week we're going to be focusing on how does this work in the field and what kind of benefit is it. So there's that answer. But then in terms of the congressmen themselves, and we'll get onto this, Sergeant Bill Moyers went and talked to each one of them and told them about the program. And if they had any doubts, and some did because some voted against it, he made sure that they understood what it was, what the program was, and responded to their doubts. He particularly went after the folks who were doubting. Went to see him 3, 4, 5 times. So that's how Congress would, I mean, how he took care of that problem that you pointed out. But, where are we? Sarge comes back. All 8 countries have said yes. You know, there were cables, but it isn't the kind of, it isn't the, I'm guessing, you can confirm this, that he didn't know all the details of what was going on.
A program officer went out to each country.
Right. Did he know all the political details of what was going on at home while he was on tour?
I have no idea.
Right. That's what I'm talking about. So he comes back, starts a recruitment push, starts a PR push, and also
creates a selection program, creates a training program, involves universities and private agencies all over the United States, as in fact the Towering Task recommended.
Right.
That in order to broaden the impact of the Peace Corps in the United States domestically, that universities and private agencies like CARE and the Experiment for International Living be involved in the recruitment, training, and overseas administration of Peace Corps volunteers.
And he also learns, hears from you, I guess, from Bill Moyers, that you're on your own when he comes back. Launches all those things. Finds out that that his brother-in-law has said, "Get your own damn bill passed," in effect. And according to Scott Stossel's biography, and I don't know if you were the one who told him this when he was writing the book, but he went to by way of his wife Eunice, he asked President Kennedy if that were so, and learned indeed that it was.
But I'm not sure that that was necessarily spiteful, which is the way Scott interprets it. I think JFK, having made that decision, understood that we were better off to be on our own.
Sarge, though, his response to that was, okay, then we got to do this. We got to ramp up. And so in the midst of everything else he was doing, he hits the ground and decides and sets up an organization headed by Bill Moyers, parallel to Larry O'Brien's.
No, unrelated.
Unrelated. Yep.
You got to explain who Larry was.
Larry was the public affairs representative for the White House. He took congressional relations, and by parallel, I meant replicating.
Nope.
Okay. What happened with that?
Well, it basically was a two-person show. Shriver and Moyers. Not a lot of staff.
And they went door to door.
They went door to door.
And they got Hubert Humphrey to introduce the legislation.
Right. And there was no trouble in the House, as I explained. The Foreign Affairs Committee people were just only too willing to climb on board.
Except for the chair of the.
No.
In the not. I mean,
Doc Morgan.
Oh! I meant the Senate.
In the House, Doc Morgan was a strong supporter of the peace corps. Pennsylvania Congress.
Without letting you know, I shifted in my brain to the Senate.
Anyway.
Because, as I understand it, and we mentioned Senator Fulbright before, who's chair of the Foreign Affairs, that he didn't like the Peace Corps, he didn't like the bill, and he held it up in conference, or in his committee.
In the documents that you'll get for next week, you'll see that there is a Shriver memorandum complaining about the fact that here it is, it's August, we're heading toward adjournment. And Senator Mansfield, who was then the Democratic leader in the Senate, in listing the priority bills, didn't list the Peace Corps bill.
On your timeline, if you look into August, you see there's a real flurry of activity there. It's the part that Bill is referring to. Sarge writes to the president seeking his support for Peace Corps legislation, lamenting the fact that it isn't listed as in the Mansfield isn't listed as one of the priority pieces. And of course, I'm sure in the back of his mind, he's got Peace Corps volunteers in the pipeline to go out. As a matter of fact, as you can see,
you had volunteers at that point in training for what was then called Tanganyika, and training for Ghana, and training for Nigeria. So, we created quite deliberately what you young people now call boots on the ground. Quite deliberately. You're going to stop it. These are the consequences of stopping it. You will disappoint these countries. You will disappoint these wonderful young people.
And the risk was, you're doing all this stuff and we haven't even authorized you.
Right.
That goes back to your question, how are they funding the volunteers
Right.
I'm really curious
and the
about.
boots on the ground?
There was a pot of money in the foreign aid program called the contingency fund, and we tapped it for $10 million, which financed the whole startup effort. And Congress eventually, after the Peace Corps Act authorized $40 million, appropriated $30 million, and that was enough to carry us through the first year.
So they retroactively fit in the 10 million to the overall budget.
We were then budgeted in the regular budget process for fiscal 62 at about $60 million.
Oh, okay.
But this is sort of Sarge's lobbyist, and I'm trying to imagine what would happen there. He writes to the president saying, we need your support. He cables John Kenneth Galbraith, who's the ambassador to India at this time, saying, put pressure on Senator Fulbright. The New York Times comes out with an article the next day saying that Fulbright is saying, well, we ought to cut it back to 10 million from 40. Sarge writes Larry O'Brien in the Public Affairs Office, asking him. This is a document that's in your it's in your papers, and as I read it, asking him to urge all the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to get the bill out of committee on the one hand, and two, to go to the House markup of the bill the next day and state their support.
I hope this is still relevant to the discussion.
Louder.
It seems like there is a lot of domestic convincing that needs to be done, but there's also an element of like international marketing. Is there any way you can talk about why that was successful in this process?
Well, I think the countries where the Peace Corps volunteers initially went really wanted them. And so instead of having interminable negotiations of these international agreements, when I became a lawyer in the State Department, notwithstanding the fact that the United States has been providing aid to Korea since 1947, we had never successfully negotiated a bilateral aid agreement. That was the first thing I was assigned to do, finally get it done. And it took me almost 2 years to get it done. Whereas by the time Peace Corps volunteers arrived in Tanzania, then Tanganyika, Ghana, the international provisions were all in place. Part of it was simplicity. We weren't asking for much.
Do you know what happened during that 2 or 3 day period with Senator Fulbright, or that would go from recalcitrance to voting to his committee voting 14-0 and sending it out?
Back in those days, markup was held in closed sessions, and the executive branch people would sit outside the door in the corridor, and occasionally you'd be invited in if some question arose that they wanted the executive branch's view on. What I remember about the markup in the Foreign Relations Committee is that Bill and I were sitting outside, and the door opened, and we were asked to come in. And he and I were sitting there, and I no longer remember what Fulbright was so upset about, but he was just beating the shit out of us. To the point where I wrote on my pad in front of me, I wrote on, how much longer do you think this is going on, Bill? And he writes back, I have no idea, but one thing I can't stand is how you can sit there and look so cool. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's clear that for some reason or other, Senator Fulbright thought this had something to do that was negative, had negative implications for the Fulbright program. And that became clearer 2 years later, getting ahead of our story again. 2 years later, Congress was putting all kinds of restrictions in appropriation bill riders on the foreign aid program, which continued to be exceedingly unpopular. And these restrictions were always phrased in terms of agencies or programs for which appropriations were made. And that meant these restrictions applied to us. We didn't want them to apply to us. We actually had in the original Peace Corps Act a waiver of the Battle Act, which prohibited foreign aid to Iron Curtain countries. And we wanted to go to Curtain countries. We actually got an invitation from Czechoslovakia that was later withdrawn. We would have honored that. Yes?
I guess I don't really understand like the opposition, because within the context of like the Cold War, that Sarge was able to get India to get these countries to agree and to be enthusiastic would be like really good for foreign relations for the U.S., right? And would it? I imagine that no matter what party you're on or what programs you're trying to support, that this idea of kind of winning, having like an up in the Cold War, which is...
You think that Nehru and Suharto, the president of Indonesia, were popular in the United States Congress in 1961?
Well, I imagine they want to beat Russia.
You know, the non-aligned bloc was very important. And this is a time, not actually dissimilar to the election we just had, where you were expected to take sides and not expected to be neutral or on the fence. Does that answer your question?
A little.
The story I was about to tell, so I decided to draft a provision that would go into the Foreign Aid Act of all places, that would say that no rider in an appropriation bill under this statute would affect the Peace Corps. And Moyers and I lined up bipartisan support for that. We had 2 Republican senators from New York, Keating and Javits. We had a very conservative but highly respected Democratic senator from West Virginia, Jennings Randolph, who was then chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. So he wielded a lot of pork power. And then I got a call from one of the assistants to one of the senators saying that the amendment had been tabled on the floor, and Senator Morse, who was a little bit of a maverick, a senator from Oregon, had asked for a live quorum. A live quorum in the Senate is a slow call. You know, the clerk says, Aiken, or he said that in those days because Aiken began with an A and he was a senator from Vermont. And there would be a long pause, and then he'd go on to give plenty of time for the senator who had called for the live quorum to find out what was going on and satisfy himself. So I got into a taxi, went up to the Hill, walked into the Senate cloakroom, and what did I see? Off in a corner was Fulbright, McGovern, who was then now a senator, Humphrey, Morse, Javits, and Keating, and Randolph. And what was going on? Well, if you're going to accept the Peace Corps from all of this, Fulbright was saying, I want the Fulbright program accepted from all these riders too. And McGovern was saying, and I want full for peace out from under. So, you know, I sat down, I scribbled away, handed it around, everybody went yes, gave it to the clerk typed it up, passed something like 65-0. Larry O'Brien got wind of what we were doing, and he called us. The White House has an incredible way of finding you no matter where you are. Bill and I were having coffee in the coffee shop at the bottom of our Peace Corps building, and payphone rang. It was Larry. What the hell are you guys doing on the Hill? Larry, you said we were on our own, and we are.
Right. So, I guess after that, the act gets out of. I mean, Fulbright releases it. I still don't really understand him, but he was against. He was an internationalist. He was against Vietnam. He was against. Okay.
Well, that was later. That was much later.
I guess that's right. We're talking 61 now. The so the Peace Corps Act.
He never voted for a Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, I do know that. He voted for the Southern Convention or whatever it was called. So the Peace Corps.
Say that a little louder.
There was a.
Don't mutter about that.
I muttered because I wasn't sure the name of it. The Southern Convention, is that what it was called? The Southern. There was a resolution passed that was signed by many Southern members of Congress who went on record saying they were for segregation, and he was one of those. Segregation. It was an anti-civil rights statement, and he signed that.
Rhodes
Southern Manifesto, is that what it is? Thank you, yes. So on the 25th of August, the Peace Corps Act is approved by the Senate. 3 days later, President Kennedy gives an address and sends them off. The volunteers depart for Ghana and Tanganyika. Roughly 3 weeks later, the Peace Corps Act is approved by the House. And then JFK signs it on September 22nd. That must have been an amazing time for you.
So here's the last story for this session. So, you know, signing a statute is a big event. And all kinds of senators and congressmen, those who are for it, those who are against it, celebrities and so forth. And I don't remember who said this to me any longer, but someone said to me, you know, you will be the only person in that room whom the president doesn't know. And he will pay particular attention to you. Don't be surprised. So, you know, the bill gets signed and everybody gets a pen and everybody's laudatory. And JFK comes over to me and says, come here, I want to show you something. He leads me over to the door to the rose garden, and he points to the parquet floor. The parquet floor is full of little holes. And I look up, question on my face, and JFK looks at me and says, Ike's golf shoes. We did it. We made it.
We did it. We did.
I didn't think we could.
But so we made it to September 22nd and to Ike's golf shoes. Thank you, Bill. And I wonder if anybody has any more questions for you. Please.
Is there someone who would like to ask that, you know, who took part in the process, would you like to ask them any particular questions like Senator Fulbright, or ask, you know, Shriver if what he thought? Would you ask him any questions about the process? Anybody in particular? After it was all over?
You know how to answer that question? I don't know how to answer that.
You mean if we could have a hologram of whoever we wanted right here with all the memories and that they had, and we had a question to ask them.
Ask their thoughts.
I mean, like, I've always been wondering, what were you?
What you have to do, this is kind of an answer to your question. There are at least two categories of people in the world whom you never mislead. You can never mislead a journalist. Ever. You can say, I don't want to talk about that. Yesterday, for example, there was a story in the New York Times about the change in the Avery Fisher Endowment of Philharmonic Hall. My wife, you may know, may not know, is the archivist historian of the New York Philharmonic for the last 30 years. So my phone, she didn't warn me about this, my phone starts to ring. All kinds of reporters who covered me when I was head of the Charities Bureau and who rely on me for comments on nonprofit issues are calling me, do you have a comment on this deal that Lincoln Center has made with the Fisher family? Of course, I declined to comment. That's perfectly fair. You can also follow certain guidelines that were laid down a long time ago by a wonderful journalist about, I will give you technical assistance with respect to your story. I don't want you to make a mistake, but I cannot be quoted or attributed. You can say, I'm telling you something that I know, but you do not know. So this is what we call background. And then there's a variation on that called deep background. And then there's something that originated actually with President Roosevelt. There's off the record. So there are categories that if you're going to deal with reporters, you need to master. Similarly, the other category are legislators. You can never, ever play fast and loose with the legislator. Why are there these two categories? Because they have to write or act about many different things about which they will never know enough. They'll never know what you know. So they rely on you to play it straight with them. There's once an experience I had into the Nixon administration. Nixon had a Secretary of State, Bill Rogers, who I had a complicated relationship with. But there was a reception for Bill at the United Nations, and I decided to go. I got an invitation, decided to go, and I walked in, and there was a congressman who was on the Foreign Affairs Committee when we were putting the Peace Corps bill through, named Wally, Pennsylvania, also later went to jail. And he was hectoring Rogers about something as I walked up. And as I walked up, Wally pointed to me and said, now, Mr. Secretary, look, you know, Josephson here, you know, he always played it straight with us. He disagreed with us, he'd tell us what his disagreement was, but if we made a decision, he'd carry it out. I extricated myself from that situation, and Wally and I walked off together, and he said to me, you know what John Stennis once said about Bill Rogers? I think we'll close on this one, right?
Okay.
He said, that Bill Rogers, he's as slick as a shithouse rat.
Maybe not on that.
Shall I close us with something else? I'll close us with something else. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. We love the interactive nature here. Can we give them a hand, please?
We love doing it with you.
And next week, I'll have you know, is going to be even more exciting. We're going to have somebody here who was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Dominican Republic during a major challenge that the volunteers there faced. And Jamie and Bill will be here, and Kirby Jones. And so we really hope that all of you will join us next week for the final workshop. And we'll send you out, of course, reminders and updates and things like that in the next week. And then I also wanted to turn it over to Steve, who's going to tell you a little bit more as he's moderating the Tim Shriver event on Monday. So he's going to tell you a little bit more about that. Come on up.
Thanks, Dylan. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to put in a special plug for the event on Monday that you have a flyer of in front of you. Obviously, you know, a big part of this entire program is to learn about the legacy and impact of Sergeant Shriver. And that legacy lives on in multiple people and multiple programs, including his own children. And so Timothy Shriver, as many of you know, leads the Special Olympics and has written a new memoir called Fully Alive. And I'm about halfway through the book, and I've got to say it is terrific. It's beautiful, it's moving, it's inspiring. He's talking about his own personal journey, his family's journey, his own relatives, particularly his Aunt Rosemary Kennedy, and their struggles with intellectual disabilities. But what's interesting, and I think relevant to this group, not just the Shriver connection, but also the way in which he's talking about, as he describes it, politics with a small p. So it's not politics as a means of exercising power or using government to affect change. It's really about politics as an act of service. And I've just been really struck by the book, and I wanted to make sure that you're aware of that. If you have time on Monday to come, it'll be here at 6 o'clock. I think all of you will very, very much enjoy it, especially given your connection to this program here. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you.
Just so that I can second that. You know, I love all the Shriver children, but from the day he was born, Timothy was my favorite.
That's another reason to come. And we'll have a conversation from 2 to 3 here in this room afterwards. If you want to ask us any questions, Bill and Jamie will stay. So that's something that's always available. We do understand if you have to head off and go to class or other things. And I'll also answer questions about the fellowship and things like that. So thanks, everyone.